Elections can be a time when, collectively, we project ourselves into the future. But they also represent moments when history is felt more acutely, when old fractures and injustices come to the surface. South Africa will be holding national and provincial elections on May 29th. Significantly, this year marks the 30th anniversary of the country's 1994 election, which was the first to be held after the fall of the apartheid regime. The country transitioned from a repressive regime of racial segregation marked by violent conflict. Globally, South Africa takes a stand against current forms of oppression, notably by recently bringing charges of genocide in Gaza against Israel before the International Court of Justice. Yet, at home, democratic South Africa reproduces many of the equalities and power structures that characterize apartheid, with much of the farmland and other wealth still owned by minority whites. What does this mean for the African National Congress, the ruling party since 1994? The ANC was a dominant party from 1994 until 2022, when for the first time in the period it received less than 50% of the votes and lost control of some key provinces. For this election, new emerging parties may play an important role. For this episode of Who is Voting in 2024, we ask, what legacies of apartheid remain present in South Africa? I am joined by two guests, Professor Mbongeseni Buthelezi of the University of Johannesburg and Matias Lopez, postdoctoral researcher at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. Thank you so much for joining us. Let us begin with the issue of land redistribution, which the elections have recharged. 30 years after the end of apartheid, has democracy delivered on the promise of redistribution and restitution? And if not, why? Let's start with you, Mbongeseni.
Thank you, Laura. On your question, no, the promise of democracy has not delivered on redistribution. There have been multiple failures in the land redistribution program in the country. And the targets that were set out back in 1994 were nowhere near meeting. The land reform program in South Africa has three elements to it. There's redistribution, there's land restitution to people whose land was taken or whose families' lands were taken after the passage of the 1913 Natives Land Act. And then there's a tenure reform element to secure tenure of people whose security of tenure remains a challenge. And on all three of those elements, the state has not been terribly successful so far. For the first 25 odd years, focus was on restitution, and there was not enough budget to start with to actually go at the pace at which we needed to go to restore people's lands. Tenure reform has also been quite challenging. I would say predominantly because there has not been political will to actually take the hard decisions that need to be taken around tenure reform. And for example, one of the key pieces of legislation, the Interim Protection of Land Rights Act, remains an interim act. 30 years later, it actually gets renewed every year. And then lastly, when it comes to redistribution, there has not been redistribution at the scale at which we need to redistribute land. So no, the promise of democracy when it comes to land, I think in South Africa is failing. We're far from where we need to be.
Thank you so much. Matias, is there something you would like to add?
Sure. Let me just start by saying that what a pleasure it is to meet you both again. I guess if I may add something, it's from more a comparative perspective, which is the focus of my interest on what are the general drivers of land reform worldwide. And what I have found is that, paradoxically, parties such as the ANC, which have a strong component of redistribution in their agenda, have fewer incentives to actually promote redistribution because they need to constantly reassure other types of elites and special business elites that they're not going to do anything crazy, that they're not going to implement some socialist-leaning policy. So that ambiguous compromise that the ANC and other parties propose, which is on the one hand, yes, I will redistribute, and on the other hand, I will make all these guarantees to property owners, accounts for this impasse that the ANC is in. Now, since democratization, they have tried a range of different technocratic solutions to that, and the ANC's policy towards land reform is quite generous to landowners. And what's on debate right now, it's whether that's fair or not. That's what's preventing the country from doing the wide redistribution that it apparently needs, right? So let's not forget that the ANC was a key actor in establishing, the type of democracy that South Africa has today, and in establishing the elite settlement that brought political stability to South Africa. And that kind of elite deal that the ANC made, it sets the boundaries toward what type of redistribution it's possible.
So let's talk now about the current elections. And I'm going to address myself to both of you. Why should we differentiate these elections from previous ones in South Africa? What's different? And maybe we can start with you, Mbongeseni.
So what's different, at least from being in South Africa, is that it feels like there's a threshold that we've crossed where the kind of disillusionment with ANC governance or ANC dominance is leading us to something new. It feels like something new is going to emerge in this election. Polls currently show that the ANC is likely to lose its majority, and we're going to see the emergence of coalitions, potentially at national, but more likely in various provinces, provincial level. So that's going to be a big change if that happens. The previous elections have shown that polls in the lead up to elections have been quite unreliable, actually. But if the ANC does lose its majority, what is surprising, paradoxically, is that what will then emerge is actually exactly what the system was supposed to do. So in some way, it's going to be a consolidation of democracy. Our system is designed, in fact, to be a system of smaller parties that govern in coalition. The dominance of the ANC is actually the thing that, for the first 30 years of democratic rule, is actually the anomaly in terms of how the system is designed. So this is what we think might happen going forward, that we're going to see coalitions at national and in some provinces. There are at least two key provinces where the ANC is likely to lose its majority. That's Gauteng and in KwaZulu-Natal. And again, one of the mix of the coalitions that are going to emerge is all up in the air. Of course, coalitions in many ways are still very new to us. And so it's going to take some time to sort of work out how coalitions work. Where coalitions have been in operation in municipalities, like Johannesburg, for example, they've been a complete mess. There's been massive instability that has had serious implications for service provision, for example. In Johannesburg, infrastructure is breaking down. There are water outages on top of the national electricity outages that we've lived with until about a month and a half ago. Yeah, that's what's going to be new. It's this emergence of coalitions potentially at national level, but most certainly in some provinces.
Very interesting, highlighting the importance of upcoming coalitions. Matias, would you like to add something to this?
Sure. So I guess the ANC, it's a very strange party in comparison to the ecology of parties or of left-wing parties worldwide. So the ANC's crisis is probably the best possible scenario for any other left-wing party elsewhere. So think about it in this way. So there are currently 4 parties on the ballot. So there's the ANC, which is likely to get less than 50% of the vote for the first time, as Mbongeseni was saying. You have the main opposition party, which is the Democratic Alliance towards the right, a more neoliberal take on what policy should look like. And then on the left, you have political leaders who were actually come from the ANC, which are Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma, with their respective parties, the Economic Freedom Fighters and the new party, MK. So there are 2 takes that I think are relevant from that party distribution. The first one is that ANC stands in the middle. So the ANC remains appealing to moderate voters, which is always a good place to be in the political competition. My other take is that if you combine the former ANC leaders with the ANC, you get roughly 60% of the vote according to recent polls, which, as Mbongeseni says, are not that trustworthy, but still, you have a clear majority of voters that, are either tending to vote towards the ANC or towards some defection of the ANC, which is still in line ideologically with what the ANC represents historically. And if the ANC indeed loses its majority and it's forced to form a coalition, then you'll have possibly two different scenarios. One would be to ally with the right. So if the Democratic Alliance, or if the opposition towards the right joins government, which is not impossible, well, it loses its raison d'etre, right? In the 1990s, you had the National Party, which was the party that ruled during apartheid, and it joined the ANC in a national unity government, and soon after it was extinguished because it lost a lot of votes because of that. So it seems like a bad deal for the DA to join the ANC. And then on the other hand, you have the EFF, which may be part of the government, form a coalition. With a few votes from the EFF, the ANC would be able to continue ruling. So that actually reinforces this role of the ANC as a source of political stability, right, and predictability. I don't think that the future government will look a lot different than what the current government is in South Africa, but that may be my naivete. I don't know.
If I may just come in on that, I think you're right, Matias. But the other factor I think we need to bring in here in terms of the instability within the ANC is that the ANC itself has factionalized in such a way that some of the former leaders of the ANC have broken away and formed their own parties. But I don't see the ANC as particularly going to be stable. The instability that we've seen in the ANC internally, at least, that we've seen for a while, that is partly the source of the disillusionment with its governance, because the instability internally has infected the state in many ways. Where the ANC governs is something that I think is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. So even if the ANC does retain a majority, or it has to govern in coalition with some other smaller party, I think we're still going to see the kind of churn that we've seen, which leads to quite a lot of instability, in fact, in government.
Thank you so much. Let me just jump in and ask you, Matias, perhaps, what kind of leader is the current president?
Ramaphosa remains in the lineage of those leaders that participated in the transition to democracy. And he played a key role in the creation of, on the expansion of ANC leaders towards the business sector, right? So at some point, Ramaphosa leaves politics and becomes a businessman, a very successful businessman. That success seems to be partly driven by a desire from the corporate sector to incorporate that kind of leadership within its branches as well. And then he returns to politics. So in a way, in my understanding, Ramaphosa represents the South Africa elite settlement for good and for worse, which is something that maybe people are getting tired of, as Mbongeseni points out, and that it's part of the internal instability of the government, but it's also part of what keeps this deal, what reproduces this deal between different elites over time and generates stability from an elite perspective.
Yes, indeed. Again, if we bring in the factionalism issue, we also need to remember that Ramaphosa comes to power after a struggle within the ANC between his predecessor, Jacob Zuma, and forces that were trying to course correct, so to speak, after what is called the 9 wasted years of the Zuma presidency, where we saw a lot of corruption flourish. We saw attempts to capture the state, be successful to some extent, and then thwarted when they became really brazen and trying to capture even the national treasury, for example. So Ramaphosa comes in, I think Matias correctly points out, as somebody who's deeply steeped in the corporate sector that has in some ways has transformed, but not transformed significantly. He is one of those people that the corporate sector is looking for, who are deeply embedded in the ANC, politically aligned. So what happens is that essentially you have the ANC gaining political power, a majority black political party, but economic power is retained in white hands, and that's still the case to this day. The people who've made it, like Ramaphosa, really who've made it big, are people who are politically entrenched in the governing alliance. And I mention alliance here also, just to remind us that it's not that just the ANC who are governing by itself. It's part of a bigger alliance with the South African Communist Party and with the Trade Union Federation, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. So it's people who, in that alliance, manage to entrench themselves among the business elite, who then circle back, like Ramaphosa has done, into politics to maintain the settlement that Matias was talking about. That also reminds me, and there's something else that we didn't talk about earlier when we were talking about what's new about this election. The other thing that is new is actually we are seeing new political parties on the scene that were not there a few years ago. Parties like Rise in Mzansi that have sprung up, but also independent candidates are now able to contest elections at provincial and national level, which was not possible before, even though that is tied up in its own problems. That comes out of litigation, a judgment by the Constitutional Court that has led to Parliament rewriting the law, making it possible for independent candidates to run. It's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory in some ways, in that independent candidates are pitted against political parties, and that doesn't help them terribly because they're going to be up against entire machines as individuals. But that's also one of the other key things that are new in this in this election.
This is all very interesting. In a number of other episodes of this podcast, we talk a lot about democratic backsliding and fears for the future of democracy. And I feel like what elements of what you're describing is actually that we might be going in the opposite direction in South Africa, that there are elements that are democratizing about the process of ANC losing a bit of ground and perhaps different economic policies. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think we are seeing the deepening of democracy in South Africa, would be my take. And the fears that we had in civil society, for example, a couple of years ago, have not been realized. Towards the end of the Zuma presidency, for example, and the beginning of the Ramaphosa presidency, we felt that the place of civil society had come under severe challenge and pressure. There was a questioning from the ruling elites, political elite of civil society. There were questions like, are you about regime change? Who funds you? There was a closing down of civic space to some degree, where we saw, for example, the use of intelligence agencies in the Zuma presidency to go after the political, quote-unquote, enemies of the governing elite. And there's been severe pushback from society more broadly against that, which has, I think, brought us to a place where I think we are seeing the deepening of democracy in South Africa.
Very interesting. Matias, let me ask you a question. You study South Africa comparatively with other countries such as Brazil. Are there some trends that you see cross-nationally that are also maybe taking place in South Africa? What's unique about South Africa? Is there something you'd like to elaborate on this?
Right. So we can think of other left-wing parties in the global South that also have strong union bases. And so the Workers' Party in Brazil, PT, certainly has the same configuration. Moderate left-wing party with that traditional background. But there's one fundamental difference in my view, between the ANC and, let's say, PT or Morena in Mexico, which you guys were discussing in another great episode that I just heard yesterday, and many others. And that difference is that the ANC was a key actor in shaping South Africa's democracy itself, right? So it participated in building the institutions that mediate and that create the different incentives that are present in South Africa's democracy. And naturally, it did so to its own benefit, as any party would do, right? So that puts the ANC in a place of advantage, of competitive advantage that other similar parties lack. Right. The other thing that it's fundamentally different, which I already mentioned, that if you compare the ANC to any other left-wing party in Latin America. The degree of support that it maintains is just amazing. Because if you think of an abstract country that it's run by a party for 3 decades, that has 30% of unemployment, that has a water crisis, that has an energy crisis, that had a president ousted for corruption charges, and that party may or may not have over 50% of the votes, that's very amazing from a comparative perspective. Because in Latin America, that party would be gone. They would have zero chances of winning an election or even being part of any coalition. So the resilience of the ANC in time to me is quite fascinating.
And let us finish with perhaps some consideration about the global implications of this election. We've talked a lot about South Africa and domestic challenges and questions. Under its current leadership, for example, South Africa has taken a stand by bringing charges of genocide in Gaza against Israel before the ICJ. Would other parties than the ANC sustain similar global leadership for South Africa? How do you see the election impacting South Africa's global role and leadership?
So I think the ICJ case against genocide that Israel is accused of committing in Gaza is South Africa's re-emergence, I think, in some ways, as a global player. I think South Africa, especially in the Zuma presidency, South Africa's foreign policy was completely unclear. And South Africa seemed to flip-flop on a lot of things and did not take any clear stance, either on human rights issues or any other matter. It came as a surprise somewhat that South Africa took the stand that it did. And it's something that's been hailed and is supported, I think, by a vast majority of people in the country. And it probably, in some ways, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. In some ways, it bodes well for South Africa's leadership in the world. In that, if you look at, for example, Egypt, this morning we woke up to the news that Egypt is now going to join that case at the ICJ. And there are a number of other countries that have announced their support for South Africa's case. That is where it seems like really that kind of re-emergence. At the same time, that kind of stand has also had quite negative implications. There's been massive pushback from certain quarters in the United States, for example, to the point where South Africa's trade relationship with the United States has been called into question. But that might well be that what we are seeing is actually a realignment globally, where, say, for example, South Africa continues to maintain a relationship with Russia, despite Russia's war in Ukraine, for example, where South Africa maintains a relationship with China and continues to try and play a role where it has some form of relationship with all the major powers in the world and is part of BRICS. And so it does seem that, at least under the current leadership, South Africa is trying to chart a path that is middle ground in many ways. It may not be terribly successful because of how vicious the pushback from certain quarters in the United States might become. As we've said in this discussion, I don't think there's going to be a significant change. But if we were to say a different coalition, might come into power, it would really depend on who leads that coalition. The Democratic Alliance, the biggest opposition party's position, is completely different to the ANC's. The Democratic Alliance supports Israel's fight against Hamas. And so if it were to be that a coalition emerges that's led by the DA, you would see something quite different emerge. But at this point, I don't see that as something feasible. I think we're going to see much of a continuation along the path that South Africa is on at present.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. We're now reaching the end of our Who is Voting in 2024 podcast episode on the upcoming elections in South Africa. I want to thank both of our guests for joining us. And you can find out more about Matias' SNIS research project in the show notes below. And of course, follow and subscribe for more episodes.